Jahida, you're on mute.
You're on mute, Jahida.
Good evening, guys. How are you? My name is Jahida Lopez, one of the founding members of the South End Roxbury Community Partnership. And tonight we're here to talk to City Councilor Michelle Wu, who's also a mayoral candidate. And she's going to talk to us about her housing plan. And we're just going to follow up with her with some questions that we developed reading her housing plan. And I would love for other South End Roxbury Community Partnership members to introduce themselves to our viewers. And then Michelle and your team, definitely introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you. So Marla, I'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Marla Smith. I work with the South End Roxbury Community Partnership. I live in the Roxbury neighborhood. I'm about 150 feet from Clifford Park and about 5 blocks from the intersection of Mass and Cass. So this subject is very personal to me because it impacts my daily life.
Izzy, you want to go?
Oh, yes. Welcome, Michelle Wu, and we appreciate your time. My name is Isaiah Garcia, originally born in the South End area. And I just want to, I'm interested in knowing what you can do for us, for the neighborhood.
Isa X, you want to go?
Hi, my name is Isabel, and I'm a part of the C Roxbury, and I would love for you to, if you become mayor, you got to do something about Mass and Cass.
Andy, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Andy Brand. I've lived in the South End for 23 years. I live about 50 feet from the corner of Mass and Harrison and 250 feet from the corner of Mass and Albany, which is arguably the epicenter, or Mass and Cass. It's kind of hard to tell. So I'm very affected by this, and I'm really looking forward to hearing you've articulated your thoughts on housing, and I love those, but I'm not as clear on what your plans are for addiction and how to get people who are addicted the help they need. And in some cases, they may not want that help, but they're sitting there on Mass and Cass and affecting the lives of all the kids, the adults, and especially the kids who grow up around the area.
Thank you for your honesty, Andy. I appreciate that. Stephanie?
Hi, I'm Stephanie Rodriguez Ruiz, and I am a Boston resident, born and raised in Boston. I'm also a child advocate, so I'm an education attorney, and I'm also a fellow Rappaport fellow. Fun little fact there.
So I know that there's some few folks that have their cameras on. So, we'll go to you, Michelle. Introduce yourself. I think everybody at this time knows you're running for mayor. And, talk to us about, what we're here for today.
Great. And I just want to pause in case, I know we heard from some folks with camera off, but I don't know if anyone else with camera off wanted to say hello with camera off as well, just in case, no pressure before I dive in. Okay, and I will mention that Tali from my team is here as well, who's been just sort of a brain in making sure that we're listening and building policy in partnership. Oh, Ryan, did you want to jump in?
All right, yeah, I just got caught in the rain, so I was finding a hat, so you guys weren't scared of what I look like, but I'll be on video in 1 second. Nice to meet everyone. I'm in the South End, and I've been involved with the South End Roxbury Partnership probably from the start. Lived in South End for 10 years and hope to call this place my home forever. So that's me when I'm not looking like this.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. So we actually have 2 plans that are very interwoven, but I think both relevant for today. So I want to just quickly I'll give a quick overview of the housing plan generally, and then maybe dive in more into our citywide plan that focuses on homelessness, substance use, and mental health, because I think a lot of the issues that we've been talking about related to Mass and Cass are kind of there. So on housing in general, this is the #1 issue that we're hearing from residents everywhere across Boston, on knocking on doors, out at community events. There's tremendous anxiety, stress, just day-to-day effort that has to go into staying in place, right? Being able to afford to stay in the city. We see that this is something, especially when there are some of the industries where people do have the luxury and the privilege of working remotely. This is a huge deal for cities now to see people leaving when it's too expensive and you can live somewhere else to work where you need to work. And so it's a matter of survival for cities to redefine how we get that cost of living down and build community and keep being that place where people feel safe, welcomed, have opportunity. And so anyway, that's a bigger picture of like, what does this moment mean? And that's why housing is so important to making sure that people can actually be part of this city that we're building. Our main plans when it comes to housing are, the big picture is, I think for too long, we've often talked about housing as something that's kind of out of our control at the city level, you know, oh, too bad, right? The byproduct of, you know, fancy buildings going in and people wanting to move in the city is gentrification. What can we do about it? It's a national, you know, market-based system, et cetera, et cetera. And so the biggest shift I want Boston to make is that we need to take responsibility at the city level, and the mayor has to be accountable for how quickly housing prices are going up, and to say this is something we are going to lean in and use city power to affect, because this is everything about who we are as a city and who can be part of the city. There are a couple levers that we can use at the city level. One is funds and resources. So far, I'm the only candidate in this race who has specifically said we are going to take a significant chunk of the federal funding we've gotten, or that we will get, and put that to trying to keep rents low and boosting homeownership. $200 million at least should go to that, so that housing is the foundation of how we think about our recovery. What will that go to? One, the city should be building more affordable housing directly, not just relying on new private developments to have a certain percentage of that be affordable, and to fight over, you know, how that happens and where it happens. We need to be sort of putting our own skin in the game. We have buildings, that this property that the city owns, and I'm going to talk about this with the other plan as well. But whether it's libraries, city parking lots, community centers, there are ways that we should be thinking about housing that's affordable to our residents anywhere that can be integrated. Zoning reform, the rules that define who's allowed to build and how high and how affordable. There should be, you know, I'm talking about restructuring our development process so that it's more fair and consistent across the board. But in the very, very short term, we need to be cutting away all of the extra red tape for 100% affordable housing projects that are proposed, and to ensure that there's just no question that we can give this the smoothest possible process to get through, because we need it. It is that urgent. And right now, I'm the only candidate also who's talking about not just building new affordable housing, but keeping our residents who are hanging on by a thread right here in our city. We need the tools of rent control and rent stabilization to do that. And there's no other candidate in this race who's been willing to say that. And it kind of can be controversial because of our experience. Hey, Domingos. Because of our experience in Massachusetts and all of that, the connotations of that. But Boston voted to, in the ballot question in the 90s, Boston voted to keep the ability for cities to affect rents, and the rest of the state did not. And we need to get to a point where we're recognizing how urgent this crisis is. And I'm not, you know, I think sometimes people are like, okay, this is an on or off switch. And that it, like with any issue, that's just not true. There's lots of different ways that we can use policy tools, and the city government can do that in almost any area. If we think about climate change or transportation or jobs, we can do a lot of different things with regulations and rules that help our residents. In this one area, it's kind of arbitrarily been taken away from cities because of that statewide ballot initiative. So we need to get that power back to be able to use it to stabilize our residents while we're building up our affordable housing supply. So, okay, that's sort of like a 1 minute on housing. And Tali, do you think you can put that link in the chat just so
Yes, I'll grab it right now.
Okay, thanks. So anyone who wants to go through all of that, feel free and, ask any questions. So just diving a little bit more on our plan. I think I've, okay, sorry, I totally messed up and I didn't even give any background. I'm Michelle Wu. I am a city councilor. I am running for mayor. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm very grateful to be back in front of this group because you all already months ago had been organizing and holding elected officials, candidates accountable. And I promised then that I was going to not just say what was wrong, but come back to you when I had thought about and sourced the information to say what should we be doing instead. So this is part of that conversation. I just want to make sure that I'm giving credit and the roses to you all for fighting so hard to make sure that this has been a consistent thread throughout this campaign in holding us accountable. What I want to say on this is that I purposely refuse to call this a mass and cast plan. And that is not to deny that the impacts have been concentrated in one part of the city and that I know very well, right? I used to live in the South End. I have been out multiple times with activists and businesses and residents in the neighborhood. We were just out, not 2 weeks ago, walking with the Newmarket Business Association down Atkinson Street, and just to see, headed into the summer, what the situation is like on the ground. So those of y'all who live in that area, and many of y'all introduced yourselves as being right in the area, you are bearing the burden, the so much of the impacts of this. So I'm not calling this a mass and cast plan because I purposely, recognizing that you're bearing that burden, I do not want to make it seem like if we just sort of sweep things out of one small part of the city, that we have fixed it. This is really a citywide crisis. I mean, it's national and regional, but we need to take responsibility citywide for this. It's about moving services citywide. It's about a lot of things outside of mass and cast. So, this is our plan related to these issues, but we are specifically thinking about it as a citywide plan, public health crisis, absolutely, to deal with the overlapping crises of substance use, mental health, and homelessness. So a couple pieces here. One, I think I see Jahida had already put this in the chat where I was gonna go straight to.
On the side, if you want to kind of take a look at them, I know that one of the burning questions is, and we're gonna ask you this, right? Yeah. Many people are like, wait, she says that, there's better ways to use the funds for, the building the bridge. So a lot of people really want to know what would you do with those funds? And would you use any of those funds to support safe injection sites in Boston? So I think that's like when we were kind of talking offline and talking to a lot of residents, a lot of people asked that question immediately.
Yeah, got it. So right now I'm the only candidate who said that I don't want to prioritize rebuilding the bridge, right? We have, and here's what I mean by that. We've been talking about rebuilding the bridge for literally 6 years now. It is, in my mind, something that has been used to deflect responsibility, to say something's coming, it's coming, it's coming. When the reality is that even if we got the approval, even if the lawsuit and that whole situation changed, the planning of it, the construction of it. I mean, we have been building bridges in Boston that no one had any problem with, that we've been wanting to build, and they've been 3, 4, 5 year long projects already, right? Much less one that is contested by the actual city where it starts from, is over the open ocean, right? Not just in the harbor. And we saw in Miami the impacts of infrastructure where it's off of the ocean and seawater and the salt and what that means and how quickly it erodes away. So when we've gotten the cost estimates for the bridge, at first it was somewhere in $75, $80 million. Next time, a couple years later, where's the plan? It was up to $93, $94 million. This would be well over $100 million of funds just to build the bridge, not even anything on the other side, all the buildings that have been sitting vacant that would need to be renovated to big costs. So I'm focused on delivering results in the 4-year mayoral term that I'm running for. The bridge, even if Quincy dropped their lawsuit, would not be that time frame. And so I'm saying, if we're already planning for $100 million plus of infrastructure. Let's use that today to have some more urgent solutions. I think in talking, in walking the streets, in talking with providers and experts and those in the area, and now trying to seek your expertise on this. As Andy had pointed out earlier, you're absolutely right. Not everyone who is currently at Mass and Cass wants to find stable housing or seek treatment today. And it varies on any given day. Sometimes how people are feeling about that, and in general, how many people are interested in that. I will say that even just a small number, a percentage of folks who do want to, who would be open to treatment and stable supportive housing, even just decreasing the density of how many people are there by 10%, 20%, 30% of people would make a big difference to the dynamic of this part of the city. And so our plan, let me see if I can, Tali, could you throw this one in? Here, actually, I have it. I'll put it in the chat. This one focuses on a couple different things. One is using our resources where we can actually have impact. So the drug trafficking there, the sort of preying on people who are seeking treatment and going through substance use, that's where our resources need to be to ensure that that is not happening. The housing that I think is at the core of whether people even have a chance to get into a different dynamic and cycle of treatment. I've spent a lot of time out at Brighton Marine, where they've had a lot of success with veterans who are formerly unhoused and have methadone on site, at St. Francis House with other providers. Having access to supportive housing, even in the range of just a couple hundred beds, would make a huge difference in terms of how our city is able to address homelessness. And with $100 million in city-owned property, we can find the space to accelerate that. We have buildings that the city is not using all the way. We have parcels of land. And so one very concrete step that I put forward in our plan is that we need to accelerate an audit of every bit of city-owned property to say, in the first 90 days, first 100 days, how are we identifying places to get these units online as soon as possible? And again, it's not going to solve the whole situation with everyone moving into treatment and housing, but even just a percentage of folks having that option and then directing resources towards public health and outreach and moving, having places to move folks into would be huge. The demand for the supply of detox beds, generally, you can find someone a bed is what I'm told by most of the providers in the shelters, but it's in that next step of longer term treatment that we have a big gap. Oh, and I should mention the last thing on the island is that we should be using, evaluating how we use ferries to activate that island, as we do every other one of the harbor islands that we're seeing programming on. And we can figure out the healthcare needs, the emergency services on island to make that possible. But I think moving away from a framework where we're just focused on the bridge to how do we move much more quickly and have a wider range of city actions is where I want to spend our energy and resources.
So I know there's someone here that can probably elaborate a little bit more on what housing, the beds look like when you're trying to help individuals navigating addiction and homelessness. I don't know if Paola wants to jump in and ask a question around that, because she does have some information and works in a space that can kind of help us unpack, is it really accessible for individuals who are on Mass and Cass to get into housing, and does it work? You know what I mean? So I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, Paola, and ask if you have a question.
Yeah, I've been working. Sorry, I'm just getting off the train. I've been working in addictions, I think, for like 5 years now. And what I've noticed is that like people will go to addiction programs, they're willing to like recover, get sober. But the programs are not long enough. Like they're there for 4 to 6 months, then they get a job, they graduate, but they're still homeless. They can't afford a place to live. And so where do they go? They go to a shelter where people are using substances, where there's like feces all over the showers, so they can't shower. Like, what are they gonna do? They're gonna relapse, obviously. So it really starts with long-term programs and like discharging people before they're ready to be discharged.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Paola. I appreciate that.
Totally.
So,
That's what
and then-
that's what I've heard from provider after provider, is that it is housing is really the foundation of how people have a chance to change that dynamic. And that's where I think our energy should be going.
Would we, in this housing plan, would you be prioritizing, because as you know, this debate's big, right? Because we know that a lot of the individuals that are on Mass and Cass are not necessarily from Boston. They come from outside of the city of Boston. In this plan, would you be prioritizing, at least because I know that your plan also is kind of general in addressing the housing crisis that we have going on, which is a national crisis. Would you be prioritizing city of Boston residents, because we know many of our families are sitting in family shelters, you know, especially after COVID, we're gonna see an increase of more homeless families and individuals. Are you going to be prioritizing the city of Boston residents who, you know, owned, you know, were in housed before and then lost their housing? Like, what is your thought about that? Because I think that kind of like what Paola said, you know, some individuals kind of relapse. And then, you know, a housing opportunity may be taken away from a family who may need that access. So how would you be prioritizing Boston residents?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's actually somewhat complicated to get housing, local priority for affordable housing, given how the lotteries work, et cetera, et cetera. I know I've spent some time talking to San Francisco because they're one of the few cities that was able to work with HUD at the federal level to allow them to have a local preference when they do their housing lotteries for people who were displaced from that census tract right in the neighborhood. And it was 2 years to get all of the program right and this and that. And I think Boston should be pushing for that type of local preference for all of our housing, you know, that require all of our subsidized housing that has lotteries, period, because we are the center city. We absorb a lot of folks who are looking for services here. And I think particularly if we're talking about community stability and neighborhood stability, having that kind of preference makes a big difference. I think the way to get there before we have those permissions from the federal government in changing the lotteries is to head this off to begin with, right? To have services that catch families before, you know, when they are couch surfing or before the point where they are experiencing homelessness on the streets, to be able to have those services wrapped around, you know, through our school system, through you know, BHA, just to make sure people can stay if they have housing, et cetera. And then, you know, to have this exact conversation with other cities. One big piece is Boston needs to be leading a regional task force where we are partnering, but also being very clear with all of our sister surrounding municipalities that we need everyone to step up to be part of solving this. And that includes ensuring that there's treatment and long-term treatment and medication-assisted treatment in different parts of the region, as well as keeping families connected so people don't feel like the only place where they have any hope of getting help is by coming into Boston and being in this part of the city.
I know Anissa has a question. Anissa, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. So I know you're calling this a housing plan, but I'm also worried at the same time that we're kind of hiding the situation at hand. Like in my opinion, The housing issue in Boston, that is separate from Mass and Cass. I think it is a factor of what we're seeing at Mass and Cass. I think we do need supportive housing for the individuals struggling with addiction. We definitely need that. However, I'm worried that we're treating this as like a one factor issue, where it is a public health crisis. And I feel like we could have an abundance of supportive housing, but if there isn't an abundance or a surplus of recovery-based treatments, then there almost isn't any gain. You're almost like just creating little units, and I don't want to say you're hiding the issue, but you're not fixing the struggles that these people deal with. And it's great that you want to create supportive housing for people struggling with addiction. However, if it's not met with a surplus of recovery-based services, then you're almost not making any progress. And I've seen it done in New York. I came from New York City, and what they did over there during COVID, and they thought putting people in hotels or putting people in random spots across the island would be beneficial, and it didn't work out because there weren't any services offered where those supportive housings were also built. There weren't any services for addiction. There weren't any services for mental illnesses. It was just, we're giving you homes. That's it.
And sorry, Anissa, it was confusing. I started at the beginning. It might've been before you had joined, saying that I was talking about two plans. We have one that's a housing plan, and then one that is a plan focused on the intersection of homelessness, mental health, and recovery. And so that one is the second link that was dropped into the chat. I don't know where it went now. I'll repaste it, but that what we talk about a hub and spoke sort of services model, and yes, so totally hear you. And I'm sorry if it was, I've been talking a lot about housing because there was a whole separate housing plan as well.
Let's see, I know that, so there's like another question around housing and the homelessness part. And how would you ensure that those that find support how would you ensure that those funds support the community, land trust, and fund capital repairs to BHA properties, Section 8 subsidized apartments, and new affordable energy efficient housing? Because even though there is, because this is a multi-layered issue, there are individuals on Mass and Cass that are navigating addiction and are homeless. And then there's also the population that are homeless and not navigating addiction, that are on Mass and Cass. So for those that are homeless on Mass and Cass, how are you going to ensure that those funds are spent on ensuring that we can get more people off of Mass and Cass who can get off and get into affordable housing units in Section 8? How are we going to help spend some of those funds to help individuals get into homes?
So this is part of the $200 million that we're talking about out of federal funds as the sort of one-time infusion, and then ongoing investments over time where we would be boosting not only funding for community land trust and permanent affordability, but I've committed to increasing the scale that we are investing in city vouchers for housing funded directly through the municipality, as well as ensuring that we are using city dollars to directly construct that energy efficient, affordable housing, where possible, integrating it into city-owned buildings like libraries, community centers, municipal parking lots, et cetera. I think one other piece that we're seeing is that there are, when we aren't supporting residents in becoming homeowners, then we're seeing rental housing sort of filled up, and then we're seeing subsidized housing fill up, and it just the whole spectrum of the range of housing options is stuck, and people are being displaced out of the city altogether. And so pushing on the home ownership side also is really important. We know that the programs that the city offers today for down payment assistance just aren't enough, and we need to increase the amount so that it's even realistic for people to buy a home with, in Boston. I was just knocking on doors earlier today in Hyde Park and heard from renters who are barely hanging on, and even people who had spent time and resources going through these home buyer classes and then realizing that they were $100 over the income, just a small amount over the income limit to even qualify. And so expanding how we are helping families, working families, as well as families who are unable to work, access subsidies and down payment assistance and, vouchers for rentals and home ownership. We need to do everything we can just to increase the supply of what's available.
So I have kind of like a follow-up question, since this is like a mass and cast topic, right? So we know that there's the engagement center, right? And a new state-of-the-art engagement center is being built. How would you, as a mayor, if elected, how would you work in partnership with this engagement center to ensure the individuals, when they're coming to Mass and CAS, we know that a lot of individuals, the first priority that it's typically done is getting individuals, Social Security benefits and food stamps and things. How can you work with the engagement center to ensure that they're really engaging individuals that are on Mass and CAS, both those that are navigating addiction, those that are navigating homelessness, to use some of those funds to put away to prepare themselves to get into a possible apartment, and kind of also tackling, would you in this space also be kind of putting a cap on on landlords who charge first, last, and security, right? Because that's real, it happens. So kind of talking about all of that, like when you think about this, how would you manage all of that?
Yeah, we need the staffing, first of all, right? I've been out there, I've seen kind of how many more, we don't have the people power right now to be able to do the type of the frequency and intensity of outreach that needs to be done. I would make sure that we're investing in our public health and counseling and social work staff to be able to connect people to resources. It's the full range of basic health and safety, housing, but also, a lot of times there are legal services that are needed, or food access, or, for young people in the family, something else related to education or the school system. And so we have models of how to do this really, really well. I used to be on the board of Rosie's Place for a long time, and they are now expanding their services to provide payment for back rent and utilities to keep people in their homes. And so that's the kind of scale of what we need, and to be responsive of what we're hearing at Mass and CAS as well, that there are a significant number of women who are experiencing assault, and to know that the engagement centers needs to be ready and prepared to provide services and respond and create the spaces where there can be safety to avoid that altogether. It's really a lot of dimensions to what that staff on the ground is having to do. And the first thing we have to do is make sure that there is enough people there to be able to serve everyone. The second piece is, taking some best practices around data, and not saying that we need to, like, it should still be a very low barrier, low threshold to get services, but we know that most of the shelters are in Boston are connected on the same, tracking is not the right word, the same sort of sign-in system, where we know where different individuals are staying on what nights, and what services, what are the types of services that they need, what are the types of medications that people need, and so that all of that lives in one place where everyone can, respecting privacy laws and health privacy and all of that, but be able to have a seamless connection, because people are they're not just staying in one place. People are moving around, people are accessing different services, needing programs, and we should be building on top of it, not asking everyone to kind of start over every time that they're going to a new place.
So okay, so kind of following up to this, because I know that part of your plan, you also kind of talked about like a co-op living opportunity. So I'm trying to figure out like how, and I don't know if other people have questions, but I know that was my first initial question. So co-ops, I think are amazing for those who want to live in co-op opportunities, kind of reminds me back in college days, right? But how do you deal with co-ops, especially kind of like what you said, is that there's a lot of people that are mass and cast women who have navigated assault. So do you think that women who are on mass and cast, who are navigating homelessness and addiction and kind of jumping into the space of recovery and trying to get integrated into their community, do you think that a co-op is actually something that would work for women who have been assaulted or men that have been assaulted on mass and cast?
I think it's, the idea is that we need to create as many options as possible. And co-ops are one way where we, if, for example, family, we've seen that I've seen and had experiences learning from women who were co-sheltered in shelter together and then decided to sort of through that model purchase a home together and just have more collective childcare support and resources, etc. It's definitely not what we're trying to prescribe for everyone to do, but to make it possible, if you did want to find ways to lower the barrier to a down payment or finding the financing, that you don't have to fit into a box of being married or have it qualifying in this way or that way for financing, but for the city to really respect that we should be putting we should be removing barriers for any situation where people are finding ways to have their support networks connected to housing. So I think there's it could work for some families. It's definitely not for other families. But right now, we're not even making it possible at all for the people who it would benefit from that. So I think the idea is we just need to try and create lots of different ways for people to access housing and become homeowners. And so that you could choose what works for you and have a lot of different options of how to put that together.
Okay. We know that there's another question around, you discussed a little bit in your plan about working. What is your vision on statewide delegation partnership to ensure that both the city and the state are on the same page for statewide subsidized public housing, transportation, smarter development, but also like gearing it towards addressing homelessness and addiction, those that are navigating addiction? How do you envision working in partnership with the state? Because we know that the state in somewhat has failed to partner up with the city of Boston to shoulder mass and cast. As we all know that Boston has kind of become what it feels like the dumping grounds of what other communities, and I want to be clear, what a lot of white elite suburban communities are refusing to own in their community, that they're now dumping in our community because they don't want their property taxes to go down. They don't want to see high crime area in their community. They don't want a safe consumption site or comfort station next to their children's school or providers. So Boston just seems like it's just been the dumping grounds of what everyone else is refusing to do. So how do you see yourself as a mayor truly tackling that? Because at this point, we need bold leadership in that and saying enough is enough, because when we on the ground speaking to people, the community's at a point they're saying, listen, then people need to go back where they came from, because before individuals became unhoused and before they became navigating addiction, some individuals had previous residential, they lived somewhere before, whether it was with a family or whether they were state of the ward, individuals, we don't know because we don't have access to that data. But if you become a mayor, how you're going to address that? Because I think at this point, enough is enough. Like, the community's tired. And there's a lot of videos that are surfacing that, people are starting to attack individuals that are setting up encampments in other cities. And I honestly feel at one point in time, the community is going to get tired and they're going to take matters into their own hands. And I'm afraid of what that's going to impact those that are already living in inhumane conditions. And we're not aiding that. So can you please talk to us how you really going to shoulder this conversation, because it needs to happen unapologetically and boldly.
That's right. That's right. And Boston can't be providing cover or just sort of for trying to be buddy with the governor or not offending people or whatever it is, sitting back and waiting. And that's the approach that I've had on the city council. And in a lot of ways, I have been speaking out, and sometimes the loudest or the only voice when it comes to the governor not pulling their weight at the state. And not just on this issue, but transportation, housing, education funding, mental health supports, climate. There's basically the biggest issues that we face are ones that don't just stop at the borders of Boston, right? They're regional, they're state. We need funding, we need coordination, and we need to be moving in the same direction. So I think I've been clear that I'm not going to be someone who is shy about calling out the state when they are not pulling their weight. I've already been doing that, and that the organizing that I'm hoping we're doing leading up to the 2021 mayoral race my plan is for this to roll right over into the 2022 governor's race. And who gets elected mayor of Boston is going to have a big impact on who gets elected governor of Massachusetts. And Boston it's not enough for us just to stop this year with our city offices, because we need the state to step up, and we need the governor to actually be someone who cares about our city and who gets that the issues at the state directly impact our residents. So at the same time, we also need to just be driving the conversation more in Boston. I think when it came to reopening and vaccinations, and a lot of times we were just sitting back and saying, well, okay, we're going to wait to see what the state does, and then we'll go from there, as opposed to recognizing that we are the center city. What our residents are going through sometimes is very different from what other parts of the state are experiencing. And so we should be setting the terms of what we need here, and the state can work around that. Not that we're going to be the bully or anything like that, but we need to be leading the charge, and we need to be clear about what our residents expect and deserve from statewide resources. I think sometimes there's this idea that, if we offend people, or if we are, stepping beyond the bounds of what the city does, then, we won't get what we need later on. But we're past the point of being able to wait for the state to recognize how urgent the issues are. So we have to drive conversations, whether it's how the T works, whether we're getting funding for the opiate crisis, how we're addressing our housing plan, the flooding and climate change. All of these are issues that technically are statewide, but if Boston were to step up and say, this is what we demand and expect, it would be a very different outcome than just sort of sitting back and waiting to see what happens.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Of course, go ahead, Andy.
So I agree with that answer, but there was one part that was not very clear to me. So specifically, the way I look at it, if I was sitting in the governor's office, I would understand the problem at Mass and Cass, but I would look at it and say, gee, I have 350 towns who are pretty happy with the state of affairs. They send their people to Boston. And I have one town, and maybe the biggest town, who doesn't like it. If I want to stay governor, I'm not gonna try to, rock the boat. All the state legislators in all of the fancy white suburbs, as Yahira said, are in the same boat. I came from Northborough. I don't see a scenario where they would agree to have any services if they could send people to Boston. So what would you do to, I haven't heard what you would do to change that dynamic, because that's a dynamic. And what would you do to you're not going to change that dynamic, but what would you do to lead and make things happen? Because right now, if I were a social worker in another town, I would know that the best place for my client to be is Boston, and I would maybe encourage them to go there. And that wouldn't be with any kind of malice or anything. That would be the best place for them. So how do you change that? What would you do to change that? Because I don't see anything changing until someone tackles that very directly.
So
Not to cut you off, but I think that what we call it is called patient dumping. Patient dumping is real in Boston. A lot of individuals are given tickets and given free rides, go to Boston. Boston, will address that. There's also, as someone who's worked in a crisis team, Ms. Wu, I can assure you that there are individuals that other facilities get tired of and refuse to take them back into these facilities, and will continue to put them back in Boston, because Boston just takes anyone, whoever. There's no data collection. There's no accountability from even the nonprofit sector, because I would love for you to even, I don't know if you have a plan or you can expand on how do you hold a lot of these service providers who do referrals and are dumping patients into Boston, especially the patients that they are unable to manage themselves or have been kicked out and banned from several different facilities throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
So I was going to say, I think there's a policy answer and there's a political answer. And the policy answer is that it was exactly what Jahida was just saying, that right now we're not really even tracking anything to be able to go back to other cities and towns, or to connect, contact people's families and see if there's other options besides being at Mass and Cass. And I think even just starting there, of really understanding what that looks like and the impact, the connection points to other cities and towns. And sometimes it might be that there are connections in terms of, organizational expertise or best practices that other municipalities might just, might not, how do I say this? Might be more likely to take up if we were to be able to say, here's a model of how you can successfully create the services to run a program, and here's how it gets funded with reimbursements from the federal government, et cetera, to make it work. I think in general, the best way we can do that is to model it throughout Boston as well. And because we're already doing the effect, what you all are just talking about in terms of every other city bringing it to Boston, we're doing that within Boston, of every neighborhood bringing it to the South End, Roxbury, Mass and Cass, right? And so even just the idea of how do we get community health centers across all of our neighborhoods to have small treatment programs of medication assisted treatment, plus the housing, plus the connections, we could do a lot more even within just to walk the walk here. And then, okay, so then the political answer is we are headed, the governor's term ends a year after the mayor's term ends in 2022. And it's going to be a big contested race. Again, the mayor of Boston and the organizing that happens, depending on what the sort of approach is of the administration, can have a very large impact on how the race for governor is shaped and whose feet are held to the fire as they're trying to campaign for those roles as well. And so for me, I've been clear, I do not support Governor Baker staying in this role. I do not think that the approach from this current administration has been anywhere near what Boston needs in terms of responsiveness and urgency. And I'm going to work as hard as I can, regardless of whether I'm elected mayor, but we'll have a larger platform if I am elected mayor to impact that race as well.
So something that kind of sparked in my head, and I don't know if anybody else has a question, but I know that since we're kind of talking about housing and your housing plan seems amazing, but I honestly, I don't know how tangible it would be for individuals that are on mass and cast. I think there's multi-steps before we even get to the housing plan that we need to literally stabilize individuals into real, true treatment and recovery services. And housing, honestly, is a big part of it, but there's multiple steps that individuals, like Paola has said, that individuals need more than 4 to 6 months in treatment facilities to truly be sober, because someone who's worked in crisis, no, recovery is not 4 to 6 months. That's just like the starting phase of just dealing with the basic. That's not including the trauma, the communicable diseases that individuals have caught while they were on mass and cast, HIV, herpes, all of those things. The mental health around that, reestablishing yourself within your family, getting connected back to your children and your loved ones. I mean, there's so many steps before we get there, but we do have sober homes. Sober homes are popular. We have many of them in Boston. How would you work as a mayor with sober homes to, one, get a little bit more regulated, because sober homes, I think, could also be very effective if they had wraparound models, that the people who bought the sober homes and own the sober homes have some level of clinical work on the work in the sober homes, and someone monitoring the sober homes to actually really help individuals before they may even get into a permanent housing through Section 8 subsidized housing. I know that that's a question that we get all the time, who's regulating and who's holding a lot of these sober homes accountable in the city of Boston to actually really serve as a provider, as well as offering a sober space that most oftentimes are kind of like co-ops. Some of them are co-ops. And how would you work with sober homes and the owners to ensure that there's a clinical part of being a sober homeowner?
Yeah, definitely. And this is a piece that's in our plan too, of really using the platform that we have in the city to even start to know what all exists in terms of services in Boston, because right now there is no place where because there's not a central kind of licensing mechanism, there is no place where we're tracking all of that and coordinating and ensuring some sort of consistency across the board. So that should be something, that should be a role that the city takes up. And I think if we want to know what's missing in terms of services, what part of the kind of spectrum of care we most need to invest in, where geographically, in what neighborhoods are there holes in certain types of services. Right now, we don't even have that baseline to know what would be the most effective use of our resources. So starting from building that up is definitely one of the first steps in our plan.
All right.
But I would love to hear from you all, because I know you've been, coordinating this a lot for a long time and doing a lot of research. Are there specifics when it comes to sober homes that you're looking for city leadership on?
I know that since we've been spend a lot of time on the ground on Mass and Cast while during our demonstrations and donating and stuff. And I know Domingos can kind of jump into this conversation, that we hear that a lot of incidents are actually happening in sober homes where women are being taken advantage of by sober home owners. I believe we actually put like a call to action on one of our Facebook posts a few weeks ago, where we were calling on a specific sober home owner to be investigated, because there's actually a website. I don't know if Justin Downey is watching and he can drop the link, who's one of the co-founders of the Mass Ave project, who brought this to our attention, that women who are in sober homes that are owned by males are experiencing sexual abuse, that there are being asked to perform sexual favors to pay rent and things that they are unable to pay, that there's a lot of dark things that happen in these spaces. But I'll let Domingos to jump in because I think you probably want to elaborate on this. Go ahead, Domingos.
Hi, guys. How you guys doing? Hi, Michelle. Nice to see you again, Councilor Wu. I guess what we're asking as a city is a buffer zone. A lot of our areas are saturated with sober homes. I know here in Dorchester on Draper Street, we have about 4 of them. Mount Ida has about another 4. Virginia Street has about 4. I know that we're getting one on Blue Hill Ave that was just put into the community without community input. So we're asking, for a buffer zone where, if these homes are going to be a part of our community, not only to engage the community upon approval of these sober homes, but also making sure that they're not, walking distance from a school, they're not near a daycare or a family ran daycare. We also want to make sure that families have inputs on, the community agreement with the sober homes. I know here we had an incident on Percival Street where an individual was buying up all the properties in the area and turning them all into sober homes. The families who lived on both sides of the sober homes had very young children. These sober homes bring in a lot of males. A lot of our sober homes, entertain male residents. There's very few who are designed specifically for women. They're mostly men. And, folks are very concerned about sexual offenders. I know down on Mass and Cass, we had serial rapists get picked up by the federal government on federal warrants a few weeks back. So our ask as a city is to make sure that we have these buffer zones to make sure that, communities feel safe. And my other, this is actually a question. What are you going to do to ensure that our youngest minds do not go down the substance use lifestyle with our BPS students? We have more than 10 schools within walking distance of Mass and Cass. The Mason already had an individual get pricked by a needle. So has the Orchard Gardens. We have the Dearborn STEM. We have the the Dudley Street Neighborhood Charter School, Madison Park, the Timothy, the Blackstone. So we're concerned about, not only the individuals on Mass and Cass, but the harm that it's causing to our youngest and our elders in our community. Me, myself, I'm just tired of this. This is going on 10 years of ongoing activism around this issue. Folks fail to realize we who live here are dealing with more than just finding individuals injecting themselves in broad daylight. We're finding folks dying in our yards, front steps, back steps, in our cars. So, we want a tangible solution where a lot of the input comes from the community. We've been left out of the task force purposely for years. I think the task force is pointless. There's too many stakeholders at that table who are going to look for their personal interests before they look at others. So we're asking you as a mayor candidate, what are you going to do to make sure our children are safe and the folks who live in the community? Because we're tired of going to South Bay Mall shopping and finding someone overdosing in the bathroom. We're tired of having to walk around with Narcan like it's part of our first aid kit. We're tired of going to the gas station and having to lock our doors and feeling unsafe to even sit on our doorsteps. So, as a mayor candidate, what are you going to do to ensure our safety? We don't want to see the police budget increase another $5 million to have individuals just corral and cage the individuals within that area. We want to actually see something that's tangible where we can actually continue to live a prosperous life in a comfortable community.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Domingos. It's unacceptable what people are experiencing now, and the ways in which every minute of your lives are oriented to just being on edge, right? About looking down before your kids are walking out to see if there are needles, about, if you have to call in again for this or that to be cleaned up. And, of course, I've been talking about having an approach that starts with compassionate care, but moves with urgency and recognizes the impacts of trauma on on everyone, all the stakeholders that are involved. And so a major part of our plan is to make sure that those services are available, and that for our young people especially, you know, I've spent time with Orchard Gardens and with the community advocates and organizers there, and to just see the decisions that families are having to make about what feels acceptable, because we're putting our young people in these situations of having to process and see and deal with what no one should have to go through, much less see that at such a young age. So I think a trauma-informed care and services community-wide is really important, but it is very much about changing the dynamic at Mass and Cass of having services, access in other places and parts of the city and regionally, but the push for housing is also, hearing Anissa's point about it's not just housing, but a whole spectrum of recovery that we have to plan for, by making sure that we are finding a place for people who are willing to seek treatment right away, are willing to access housing right away, so that it's not such a concentration of need and of people in that area.
So with that, Wu, I know we can probably end because it's going to the hour. How would you address in the kind of like the zoning part of all of this, right? To what Domingos is saying, we have endless amount of sober homes, methadone clinics, everything centralized en masse in Cass. And I know that we talk about kind of like hoping that every community health center can kind of, take a little bit of ownership. But at the end of the day, I mean, I don't think that even if we decentralize like that and having community health centers take on some of this role, I think that people are talking about more like, I think Boston has held down the fort for a very, very long time. So how can you kind of help us or help improve and update the zoning laws that have not been updated in a long time? Like how many liquor stores can go on in 1 mile, especially in the inner city? How many, in just on the methadone clinics? And again, this, please guys, so please don't spin narratives here. This is not to say the methadone does not work. We're just saying in a 5-mile radius, why do we have over 5 methadone clinics in a 5-mile radius? Like it just, to us, like we're trying to figure that and like making sense of how do we improve that to ensuring that Boston kind of says like there's only so much that we can take on that's going to take away from residents, that are going to take away from the businesses, that are going to take away from housing opportunities and healthcare for all other things. You know what I mean? And
No, I totally hear you. I guess I just, I want to be honest that I feel like it's easy to say, I'm going to make sure that other cities pull their weight and, that we're making sure Boston is taking care of Boston's business and everyone else is taking care of their business. There's only so much that, I'm going to fight to make sure that we have regional partnerships and we are working with other cities and we're not just picking up the phone in times of disaster, but building those relationships day in and day out, because that's the only way where we have a chance of that happening. But I don't want to pretend like the mayor of Boston is going to be able to tell every other city, that they're going to do it. I just want to be clear about that. So I think the best thing that we can do is model it here, of keep the focus on the state and keep the urgency up and be clear about documenting the problem. Sometimes if we're not collecting and sharing the impact on our residents in a citywide way, if we're not connecting the dots locally, we're not doing everything we can to drive the case for why the state has to step up and put some more funding in and put some more of these zoning regulations in, all across the Commonwealth to make this happen. I've been pushing for a long time that the city's zoning code and plan or lack thereof is really driving inequities across the city. It is what makes it so that our communities are segregated and there's a concentration of resources in some areas and challenges in other areas. And so getting that right and having a citywide plan is really, really important to making sure that we are having one conversation and not just pitting communities against each other, pitting neighborhoods against each other. So that's, every individual has lots of different things that they need from their city government. And I think when we have conversations in vacuums of, okay, now we're talking about addiction, now we're talking about housing, now we're talking about schools, when it's all interconnected. And so that most of all is the kind of leadership I want to bring to say, how do we really talk about the whole person and the whole community in putting together a plan that addresses everything that we're trying to talk about and gets us on track to at least, we're not going to solve the whole thing tomorrow, but as long as we have a plan, even if we need to deviate from it, we can make sure that the next steps that we're seeing progress every single day. Because right now it's been a whole lot of time, a whole lot of talking, a whole lot of task force meetings, and then not task force meetings, and then back at square one without anything really happening except for, people are working really hard. City workers are collecting needles as fast as they can collect them and cleaning the sidewalks now 2-3 times a day. But at the end of the day, we're just spinning our wheels and we're not actually seeing the situation change. So we have to get down to root causes.
Yeah. Marla, I'll let you end so that I know it's already 8:12, so I don't want to take up too much of her time, but you can end with your question and then kind of close us out after that.
Mine's really more of a statement. What we want here at Mass and Cass is the same thing that the rest of the city already enjoys. West Roxbury has beautiful, clean parks. Pope John Paul Park in Dorchester is beautiful. There's kids playing there. There's no needles. Kids down there can throw themselves in the snow and make snow angels. They can kick the leaves. You can't do that in Clifford Park, and you're robbing the city, not you. The city is robbing children of the full childhood experience that they, as members of this city, ought to be entitled to have. And further to that, what message are we sending them about how valuable they are to this city? We're telling them that Black and brown children in Roxbury are less important than white children in other parts of the city. And that is simply and plainly not fair. And yes, Mass and Cass needs more attention than other parts of the city. And if that fails to be equitable, well, it's because we've been neglected. And that's what needs to be addressed. And I'm sorry, I'm frustrated. I'm sick and tired of hearing people. I've been living here for 28 years. It's been a problem for 28 years. And mayor after mayor after mayor has ignored it, has done nothing about it, and just dumps things here that the rest of the city doesn't want to deal with. They don't want a methadone clinic, so they don't get one. They don't want a jail, so they don't get one. They don't want a Suboxone prescriber, so they don't get one. They don't want the disaster that's at Atkinson Street, so they don't get it. But Roxbury gets it, and nobody asked us whether we wanted it. We just got it. And that's so completely and utterly not fair.
Thank you, Marla. Yes.
Yes, Marla. Yes, Marla. Mingos, you got one more question. We gotta go. It's 8:13. Let's go. Let's go. I don't want to take up too much.
And I'm sorry, Councilor Wu, just one last question, because you hit the nail on the head. What would you do as mayor to revise the 1991 ordinance regarding needle exchange program?
What do you mean specifically in terms of making it available in different places or not having it located in?
The program doesn't work. The city gives out 10,000 needles a week, and we as a community collects 5,000 of them. So there's no way in the world.
Got it.
You know, I understand Councilor Anissa Savvy George
just passed
put out
that new one.
you know, to have, needles be collected at pharmacies and so forth, but those needles are going to be, individuals like my mom who's a diabetic. The city put up 15 needle kiosks, and we're yet to see 1,000 needles come out of one kiosk. We have a program now who's giving 20 cents a needle part of a needle return program. I have folks who travel up and down my street who I give bottles to, and I got a back seat full of them because I feel bad for the lady who has to go through the trash to pick them out. She gets 5 cents a can, but individuals on Atkinson Street can exchange a needle for 20 cents versus, a program that was supposed to make sure that you bring one, you get one. You bring two, you get two. That program is broken. The ordinance is from 1991. It doesn't fit today's needs. It did fit the HIV epidemic of the 90s, but it's not fitting today's opioid crisis here in Boston. So what would you do to ensure that, it's an AHO program that the city runs? Thousands of needles. I have footages of where I was able to get over 15 to 20 needles within a 2-minute span.
Yeah.
So the program is broken. What would you do to ensure that we don't see these needles being dumped not only in our playgrounds and our schoolyards, but in our sewage system? That's the other part that folks are leaving out of the conversation. A lot of these needles wind up in our sewage system. And of course, that winds up in our treatment center. And that brings back the recycled water that we use within our home. So it's a big ongoing conversation.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think, we talk about wanting to make sure that we're expanding access and the kind of impacts on residents where these are the sort of collection points and the distribution points are concentrated. It's just staggering, the scale of how many are coming in and how many are we're even missing and are sort of found. So I think, Domingos, it goes back to what you were talking about earlier, the fact that if we're trying to design these solutions and ordinances and write laws without community members who are actually on the ground experiencing this, we're not going to get at what we're, actually solving the problem and changing the situation. So I think it is very much about making sure that we are bringing people to the table who are, have been doing the work and have been advocating. And I'll make sure that this is on the list as well, that the AHOPE program and the needle collection and distribution is something that we're reviewing among, all the stakeholders who are living this every single day.
For sure. We appreciate that, Michelle, because I also, kind of to end this, I think that at one point in time, we have to hold the service providers on Mass and Cass accountable. There are nonprofits after nonprofits after nonprofits in this location that provide a service. They too should help the city of Boston with the needle pickup. The city of Boston should not be fully responsible for the only city agency, the state, city in a state that does this while other people provide the service, right? Even though it's a city-based ran program, why aren't we holding these nonprofits accountable for the initiatives that they bring forward into helping us fund some of those programs with some of the funding that they get through private donors, grants, or whatever the case may be? There has to be, some level of accountability. And, Ms. Wu, we appreciate you. Thank you so much for keeping it real and saying, we can only do what we can do. And I appreciate it because not too many candidates come in this space and tell us that there's only so much you can do in this role and advocate as hard as you can. But the reality is, like you said, others have to adapt to this. And we really appreciate you being very transparent and honest about that. So thank you so much for your time. We really do. Thank you.
No, thanks. I think it's what Isabel is. That's exactly it. Is we can only do what we can do, but we have to have action every single day. We have to be just moving forward and pushing as hard as we can. And
coming for you. We're coming for you.
Absolutely.
Well, she's not saying for you, but she's saying,
for everyone, for all the public officials, because at the end of the day, we have to pressure them to do their job because they're working for us. So if you're working for us, it's by the people, for the people.
That's
and
right.
We're tired. We're tired for our children, for everyone, okay?
All right. Well, thank you, Ms. Wu. We appreciate you, and you have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Let me end this live.